there are 8 billion humans on Earth. The Space Force Association is bringing over 2,000 of them together, all with the common goal of preserving and protecting our thriving space domain. The most critical space power challenges will be addressed. This is your invitation to be part of the solution. Attend the Space Power Conference and help secure our nation's legacy in the stars.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us today for another Space Force Association Space Warfighter Talks. Today we are honored and humbled to be with a strategic visionary, an operational commander, a tactical expert, and for the rest of the introduction, I'm going to defer to General Shaw, our guest today. Actual ceremony.
Where'd you get that?
Personally written. I think it is the best way to describe this legend in our space community. He also performs lead vocals and rhythm guitar for the very locally renowned band Space Jam. He continues to be puzzled at how he ended up with such a pretty and witty daughter, handsome and genius son-in-law, and above all, beautiful and brilliant partner for life. He fears the universe has made a mistake and hopes it doesn't catch on. The Deputy Commander of the United States Space Command, Lieutenant General John Shaw. Sir, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Matt. Just so your audience knows, I did not know Matt was going to read that in advance. He said he would introduce me, but I didn't know you'd pull that out of the program.
It was an incredible, we'll talk about more of that later, but it was an incredible event. So unique, so personalized by you, I think. For those that didn't get an opportunity to be there, which the crowd was unbelievable, I just wanted to share that. But sir, thanks for joining us today and really wrapping up pretty soon here a 33-year distinguished military career, culminating here as the Deputy Commander of U.S. Space Command, and which is ironic. So we just briefly talked about a ceremony, but here we are in U.S. Space Command, and you're still working. So can you explain that to a little bit of us and to our audience? And there's some nuances there. You're not the only one doing it in the DoD right now, but
yeah.
On a personal level, can you explain what's going on?
Well, sure. And you're right. There's a lot of folks that are, quote, in overtime right now that weren't planned to be retired or moved on or moved into different jobs for ones that they've been confirmed for and such. But yeah, it was originally going to be my last day when we had that ceremony on the 8th of September. But you know, as we moved through the summer and realized that my successor was probably not going to be confirmed in time, I kind of changed my terminal leave plan a little bit and squeezed in a little bit more time. So I did an extra 4 weeks of overtime, but that'll end on the 5th of October.
Yeah, we greatly appreciate that.
Imminent, yeah.
So did everybody else on the 8th of September that was in the audience that day. As I had the honor of representing SFA at your ceremony, and it was a who's who in the space community. And General Hyten, as we all would expect, was just perfect in describing yourself, your family, and your career, which started off at the Air Force Academy back in 1990. And he, for those that were not able to be at the ceremony, he uniquely described how you weren't the smartest man in the room, and then went on to describe all of your stratifications and accolades, both in academic scenarios and operational scenarios. We just all got a great chuckle on it. But I wanted to, as I looked at you during the ceremony, I knew you were looking out at your family, your closest friends, your work colleagues. Can you give us a little peek under the tent about what you were thinking while you're on stage as this legend is talking about you for at least 45 minutes, it seemed? And then also, you chose to call it a commencement, not a retirement ceremony. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I'll answer that first one first, Matt. I never liked that word retirement. I used to I did joke leading up to the ceremony that I think it was made up by some 20-something-year-old that said, oh, it's time to put this senior officer out to pasture or take him outside behind the barn or whatever. It sounds so final. And I really just saw it as just a chance to kind of do something different in my life. You know, I'd like to say I've done the math and life is short, and I plan to make the most of every part of it. And so one phase is over, and I'm going to move on and graduate and go to the next one. I also don't like terminal leave, by the way. Why is it terminal leave? It sounds something.
It sounds like something's bad going to happen.
That sounds bad. Something's going to happen at the end of that. You know, we should call it transition. I don't know. We should call it something else. So I actually threatened for well over a year that I was going to call it a commencement ceremony, and I said, hold me accountable on that, and I felt I had to make good on that. Yeah, when I was sitting on the stage, first of all, I was just honored to have General Hyten to be there. You know, he and I do go back a ways to when I was Captain Shaw and he was Lieutenant Colonel Hyten, and we were all working in the Pentagon together. But it was just, it was an honor to have him there. I think what the memory I have the most and what I was thinking about the most, and I mentioned a little bit in my comments for the ceremony, was being amazed at how many people I've known on my journey that were in that room at that one time.
Yeah.
I think I said something like, you know, I don't know what I don't know about heaven, and or Shakespeare would say, the undiscovered country, whatever lies beyond this life. But I hope I caught a glimpse of it, right? Just a chance to suddenly be with all those souls together all in one place. That's the thing that really most impressed me. I had my freshman year roommate at the academy there, and then I had all the people I worked here at U.S. Space Command, and then everyone in between. I mean, there was a representation for almost everything I'd done. That's what I was thinking about, just how honored I was to be there and have everybody there.
Yeah, and the continued reflection on your family and what each of them are doing now, it was a wonderful event. So thanks for opening it up to everyone. And I know we got a lot of feedback at SFA that was, they really appreciated it having an online option where people could join remotely all around the world that have been in your career for all those years. And speaking of an incredible career, when we talk about the different levels of command and the experience, when you think about, you know, Cadet Shaw, and you even walked through the beginning stages of that, and so did General Hyten at that ceremony. Obviously, over 33 years, you've had a lot of commands, you've had staff jobs, you've had school. Can you highlight some of those that just, when you're an old man looking back, and you're like, these are the ones that my family and I will remember? It could be operational, it could be personal. Our Guardians, there's a lot of them that want to be you one day. So share some of that with us.
I guess I almost have to start with a little bit of an origin story, right, in order to kind of lay the context for it. And so, you know, even long before I went to the Air Force Academy, I was definitely interested in space. I knew that's what I wanted to study. When I knew I was coming. I come in on day one, and I knew I was going to study. I was going to major in astronautical engineering. I was hoping maybe one day be an astronaut. Talked a little bit about that. You know, things don't always work like they're planned. Actually, my original plan way back was to play right field for the Red Sox. That's the first plan that fell apart. So, but you just kind of keep pursuing what you're interested in, and then. I guess if I had to talk about like key memories I have through my career, you know, early on, just being a spacecraft engineer and working hard on whenever there was a satellite, something would go wrong. Just getting a team together and figure that out. I always thought that was a fascinating thing to do. You know, fast forward and I'm a mid-level captain. Assigned out of the Pentagon and go to the United States Air Forces in Europe. He didn't send astronautical engineers to Europe back then. I just had somebody who was willing to give me a job working in the Air Operations Center there. And that was just as the name Kosovo has become a household word. You know, and you know, we look back on it now, that was the last century, but the air war over Serbia was actually a significant inflection point for NATO at that time that I think informs even how they're looking at themselves today with the challenge we're seeing in Russia, Ukraine. And so that was just a pivotal time for me in the Air Operations Center, trying to integrate space into that campaign, and not only a joint but also a combined campaign. I think the jobs I'll remember best, though, and look back, will be the command jobs. And so the 2 wonderful years commanding what I call the world's greatest Space Operations Squadron, Force Ops, which is still out there out at Schriever. What a great team working there. 50th Operations Group just a little ways later, also out at Schriever. No, that command doesn't exist anymore. We have Deltas now. And then the 21st Space Wing at Peterson, which was actually a worldwide command. So I just remember being so proud of all of our missions sprinkled out throughout the entire planet in that particular mission. That also doesn't exist anymore as an organization. We've changed things in the Space Force. And then 14th Air Force Command out at Vandenberg. going out, and actually being the last commander, at least as of the time of this interview, the last commander of 14th Air Force, because it was redesignated Space Operations Command while I was there when the Space Force stood up, and we worked a transition there and did that all and through COVID. And then I could just go on and on with other things in between. Matt, you know, being the deputy commander of Air Force Space Command as we stood up the new U.S. Space Command, and we saw Space Force coming. Just kind of getting ready for that and thinking about how would we do Space Force differently, how would we organize it differently, and working with a team that focused on that particular issue. And all along the way, I remember wanting to think and write, and so that's another thing that might be a theme that I'd share with the audience here, is just the desire to kind of think about some ideas and put them into writing and publish those. So I started doing that as a young company grade officer, and I'm still doing it today, and I don't think I'm going to stop.
No, that's great. There's a number of Guardians that volunteer with SFA, and they are thought leaders. And that's, I think, if you were to ask...
I think that's wonderful. I just encourage them, keep doing that and putting those thoughts out there, because that's how we're going to get better.
Absolutely. And this is what General Saltzman's asked them to do. He said, hey, we debrief, we talk about it, go have a beverage, go have dinner, write it down as you did. And I think that's a great segue to my next question. You recently penned an op-ed in Space News. Welcome to the third space age.
Yeah.
It is a very unique way to think about where we are now, how we got here, and more importantly, where we're going. And a lot of our viewers are not three-star generals in the Space Force with 33 years of experience. Sometimes we just have people that are curious, and they support the Space Force, they support our military, or they may be civil or commercial. Can you explain what you wanted to get across and maybe expand on a little bit more in that op-ed that you recently put out?
Yeah, sure. And there's probably some in the audience that read the op-ed or maybe heard me talk about it, but it is a way to think about why. I think we all sense there's something different going on right now in the space domain, that there's been change, and we're still trying to come to grips with it no matter what sector you're working in. When I say sector, that could be the national security sector, which is military or intelligence community space, right? Or commercial sector, or the civil sector, primarily NASA, but maybe NOAA and other organizations in the executive branch. And so, what is it? And so I was trying to think about, in terms of historical context, what is different? And the idea is that, I think we're in this third space age. If you look at it, of the first space age being the Cold War, and we had a singular adversary, and it was mostly us and them. It was pretty bilateral. And it was mostly focused on national security issues. Even the Apollo missions were really sort of a national security issue. It was a contest of ideologies. Yep. And I think lots of historians would resonate with that. And then we had very little commercial in that first space age, right? In the 1980s we started to see a little bit of commercial space, but very little. And then there's this really sharp inflection point with the end of the Cold War. And what had been our adversaries in the domain, the Soviet Union. And by the way, we need to remember that during the Cold War, we were talking about a war that could extend to space. It didn't get talked about publicly, but it was something we definitely talked about as a Department of Defense. But then, bang, there's the end of the Cold War, and we are suddenly now, from at least a civil perspective, we're partnering with what used to be our adversary, sending our own astronauts to the Russian Mir space station, and ultimately, as we're doing even today, sharing the International Space Station, doing that together as a partnership. So from a civil perspective, we sort of flipped it. And I'd also point out that from a civil, particularly a human spaceflight perspective, we routinized travel to low Earth orbit, but we didn't go any further than low Earth orbit. We just barely got off the beach. I mean, I'm just saying, it's all relative how you think about that. From a commercial perspective, things started to pick up a little bit. Used to be only really large organizations had satellite dishes, but in the 1990s, everyone started getting their own little satellite dish, and we could use space. GPS became a household word. We didn't know what that was during the Cold War, but it became something that everybody uses, and that our society uses today in such a dramatic way. And then from a national security perspective, and during most of my career, space was all about delivering those capabilities to the tactical level. No longer the strategic level of the Cold War, but down at the tactical level. And in the midst of all that, we were not under threat in the space domain. So again, most of my career, we may have talked about things like a space Pearl Harbor, being prepared for that, but the reality was we weren't under threat. So really what we're trying to do is optimize those capabilities for the terrestrial domains. And then somewhere in the 20-teens, I think you can localize it to right around 2015, we hit another inflection point. It's not as bright a line as the end of the Cold War, but all three sectors started to change simultaneously. So you had the civil sector, NASA primarily, now really focused on getting back to the moon. You know, they talked about it in the early 90s, they talked about it in the early 2000s, late 2000s with the Constellation program, but now, yeah, we're really going back to the moon this time, and they got the funding and the plan to go do it. And commercial really started to hit some different inflection points altogether. You know, 2015 is when we saw the first core booster land back on the pad that SpaceX executed, starting to really change how we look at space lift. It's also the same year that SpaceX filed its license for Starlink, the first large-scale proliferated low Earth orbit comm system. And now, you know, as we see that today, it seems like it's probably supplanting geosynchronous comms in many, many ways for commercial users, private users, and maybe even military. And then from a national security perspective, some dramatic change. It was in 2015, because I remember it. It was actually the National Space Symposium in 2015 is when you could really want to look for the inflection point, is where we started to talk about space as a warfighting domain publicly and really started to think about that. We had seen the threat develop. There had been some talk about it, but 2015 is where we really started to talk about it, and it enabled so many other things that came after, such as including the stand-up of U.S. Space Command and U.S. Space Force. And why was that? Because we were under threat. We slightly under threat in the first space age, not at all in the second, but now we're under threat in the third space age, and that is not slowing down. When you take those all together, Matt, in this third space age, it's the most amazing thing is how interconnected all these sectors are now in ways they can't ignore each other. NASA now relies on the commercial sector to get its astronauts to the International Space Station, and it will rely on commercial as it continues to Artemis in ways they never did in the Apollo era. And we rely on commercial in the national security side more than we ever have before. We're using more imagery from space and space domain awareness capabilities to space than we ever have before. It's really part and normal of what we do. And then I point out that commercial is now dependent on national security to some extent. There are possible threats in the domain. Commercial capabilities have been threatened by Russia explicitly. So we will consider them targets if they're contributing to a war effort. And so we're all interconnected now in ways that we weren't before, and we can't afford not to think about all those sectors as we go about our business.
Yeah, we've seen the old Cold War academic thought leaders on deterrence really resurface again when about a year and a half ago, when the Ukraine-Russia conflict kicked off, and we saw what happened with Elon Musk's Starlink and the ramifications of that playing out. We've seen them change the game with SpaceX, particularly with making it cheaper to launch things to space. Just over 2 years ago, we saw Jared Isaacman and the Inspiration 4 crew go to space.
That was commercial, all right? But who would have thought that would happen? We knew it was going to happen, but it's interesting to finally see that happening in this beginning of the third space age.
And now, you know, in a few months, he's leading another effort called Polaris Dawn, where they're going to go and really push the boundaries. I would argue, these are Americans that are not just joyriding in space. They're really pushing some capabilities up there that will definitely benefit the national security apparatus as well. SFA is a big fan of them. They've been flying rank of Air Force Academy cadets to space. So when the 10% of each Academy class graduates that goes to the Space Force, they've already got second lieutenant bars that have been to space. That's Jared Isaacman's been doing that. Yep. So they are so connected in so many ways. But I wanted to pull the thread on something you alluded to, and that is the threat we're facing today. General Saltzman talked about where he was in 2007. Lieutenant General Deanna Burt has done the same thing. I know it is, in the space community's mind, it's almost like a 9/11, but they weren't allowed to talk about it. You weren't allowed to talk about it for so long. but it is a credible threat, whether you call it a pacing challenge, a near-peer adversary, whatever national security strategy comes out and renames it. It is a credible threat, and that's driving everything. General Gutlein out at SSC's got essentially a basketball shot clock going on to remind his acquirers that we are here for the warfighter. Can you talk about that credible threat, what we're doing about it, and then where you see it going into the 3 to 5 year range?
Yeah, I think a couple of things to kind of, some observations. So first are, you know, we talk about that 2007 satellite intercept test that China did. It's definitely a milestone in this journey that we've talked about. I usually do like to point out that they were not the first nation to do a satellite intercept test that caused thousands of pieces of debris. That nation was actually the United States.
That was us.
In 1985. And again, for your audience, you know, they can go look that up, right? But it was the ASAT from an F-15 in 1985. But you know what we learned from doing that in 1985 is that we shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, there's a lot of debris now we got to track this debris. It could be a problem. We're going to stop doing that. In 1986, I mean, you know, and we're not doing that anymore. China executes the test in 2007. The thing is, they didn't really stop developing those capabilities. They did that, but they didn't stop. They've continued to develop, and much more diverse kinds of capabilities, ranging from jamming to directed energy to kinetic kill and such. And so they've continued. So 2007 could have been an inflection point where they said, we're not going to do that either, but they did not, and that's a significant difference. I also would want to point out that I actually lost a bet in 2021 when we knew, we kind of had a good idea the Russians were going to do an ASAT test. But, you know, I've actually spent a good amount of my career studying Russia. I spent time in Russia. And they're very proud of their legacy as as the first spacefaring nation, right? And I kind of say, you know, I don't think they're going to actually do an intercept. They'll do an offset. They'll miss it by a certain amount, and they'll validate that their capability works, because they're proud of their role. They want to be that senior statesman in space. I was wrong.
Yeah.
And I was very disappointed. So I just point out that happened too. So the Chinese event, the Russian event in 2021. But we should be curious and be asking, you know, should we be surprised that China and Russia continue to develop, started to, and continue to develop counter space capabilities? Should we be surprised? I think the answer is no. They have seen how we use space and have been using it since really the first space age, but continue to get better at it to enable our ability to do warfighting in the terrestrial domains. You know, our joint warfighters use space more today than they did yesterday, and they'll use it more tomorrow than today. It just keeps on going. So we use it. They see that. And they also see that traditionally we haven't done the best job of making those systems resilient or protecting them against attack. It's a simple math problem. You put those facts together, it adds up to, hey, this is a vulnerability that the United States has and that we need to exploit it. It's that simple, and that's why we're seeing what they're doing. We shouldn't be surprised. You know, you pointed to deterrence theory. There's a whole line of deterrence theory that talks about instability due to vulnerability, right? If you're vulnerable, then that's destabilizing in a strategic relationship. You actually want to be robust, and that's what stabilizes the situation. So we've actually had something where at the end of the second space age, being a third space age, we had a destabilizing situation in space because we were vulnerable and we needed those capabilities. I think we're working hard at that. I won't try to walk through everything that we're doing between Space Force, Space Command, and the Department of Defense and so on. I think your listeners, your readers, watchers here know a lot about that. But we realize we need to make our capabilities more resilient. We need to probably have layered defense. We need to develop architectures that are less vulnerable. We need to take a lot of steps to turn that vulnerability, instability piece of the equation into a stable one. Because at the end of the day, our goal is to deter a conflict that extends to space. And I'll end the thought by saying, and I've said before, space is so important to what we do. And our adversaries know that if we can deter a war that extends to space, then we can deter a war. Because they'll never make that step, and they realize they can't deprive us of our space capabilities, and so they won't even want to go to war in the first place. That's the ultimate achievement that we want.
Yeah, and I think that's important, and SFA tries to carry the water there. This is a deterrent mission first. If deterrence fails, our nation will do what it needs to do, and to include the Space Force. And we really appreciate General Saltzman's continued efforts to, hey, it's not just about the capabilities, it's not just about the technology, it's about the Guardians, it's about their training, it's the TTPs, it's the Rangers, the ranges that they train on. That's all part of the whole machine, and we need to get the whole thing ready to go if deterrence fails. But deterrence, no doubt, is the mission there. We've talked a little bit about how these are not just Space Force or U.S. Space Command capabilities or efforts. This is the joint force. And there continues to be every chance we get in SFA to say, hey, this is Space Force, this is Space Command. Recently, a joint pub was published end of August, pushed out in September just recently. Joint Space Operations, JP 3-14. I'm one of those guys that read it cover to cover. I loved it. I think it gives some good guidance, and it emphasizes this is a joint force. Space Force is part of it. Space Command is part of it. Some things stood out in my mind, but I'm curious what stood out to you. What did you see this is different? And in your current role as the Deputy Commander of U.S. Space Command, no doubt you had input. No doubt there's strategic messaging here. Can you share a little bit about that with us?
Yeah, sure. I'm pretty proud of the latest 3-14. I've seen a lot of versions of them over the years, right? This is the most different, I think, from all those, and it sounds like you might say the same. And the idea was and by the way, it was a team effort. U.S. Space Command sort of had the lead for this particular this version of this publication, this edition. But we worked closely with Space Force and the rest of the Joint Force on it. One of the concepts in there is one that I've actually written about a couple years ago, and it's this idea that the old U.S. Space Command, 1985 to 2002, and U.S. Strategic Command, when it inherited the space warfighting responsibilities from the old U.S. Space Command in 2002 until 2019. In neither of those combatant commands was space ever an area of responsibility. And so both of those commands, from their space perspective, were what are the classic definition of a functional combatant command in joint doctrine, right? You provide trans-regional support to other combatant commands. So what was unique about when we stood up the new version 2.0 of U.S. Space Command in 2019, the President gave us an area of responsibility. I actually think it made a lot of sense. There's a much deeper discussion in how we got there. There was always this idea of an AOR going back to the latter 20th century, or a joint operating area, whatever you want to call it. But it was put, finally. We were assigned an area of responsibility. And so the concept was, well, that changes things a little bit. Because now that we are assigned an area of responsibility and we have missions within that area of responsibility, we now are responsible for protecting, defending activities and or capabilities and things that are happening in that AOR. And that has implications for supporting and supportive relationships, for prioritization of resources, for synchronizing operations in our AOR with the terrestrial AORs in a broader global engagement. And so I think we're still unpacking all that, what that's going to mean for us in the future. One thing I pointed out is that this is the first AOR in the history of military history that is not geographic. Yeah. It's not defined by borders on the planet or lines on a map. It's in space forever and for the first time. And so it's not really geographic, right? Because it's in space. It's not on Earth. It's on space. So you'll see in Joint Pub 3-14 we do have the word astrographic in there as being the first AOR that's not geographic. Maybe we can talk a little bit later where I think we're headed. I don't think it's the last astrographic AOR. I think there will be other ones, but this is it for now. One of the other concepts in 3-14 comes out of a lot of work that we'd been doing, particularly in our J5, on our plans, and in particular getting the first O-plan for space ever approved by the SecDef earlier this year, here in 2023. And it had to do with, as we synchronize our plans with whatever terrestrial combatant command, geographic combatant command that we're conducting operations alongside with as we try to synchronize those plans. A lot of what we were doing was, hey, we need to gain some advantage over an adversary in the space domain to allow freedom of maneuver in the space domain, but also in the terrestrial domains. And we talked a lot about space superiority. And what does that mean? It turns out we really struggled to be able to measure when you think you have space superiority. It depends on so many things, on what your adversary is doing, what your objectives are, what capabilities you need versus that you need to prioritize, and how do you do that? And we realized we were going through that if the president ever said, so do you have space superiority, we'd have a hard time answering that question. Yeah. But we thought we could at least talk about where we got to incremental progress against an adversary in the domain. Depriving them of some basic level of being able to hold our capabilities at risk, and perhaps holding their capabilities at risk. And so we came up with a new term, and that's also in 3-14. It's called suppression of enemy space capabilities. And yeah, it's borrowed a little bit from a term we know in the air doctrine. But I think what it does is it realizes you're not probably ever going to have a dominance in all parts of the Earth-Moon system, in the electromagnetic arena as well as the physical arena at all times. But we might be able to deprive an adversary of just enough of this and just enough of that and just enough of this, and we can measure that. And then we can say we've suppressed their space capabilities to a proper threshold that allows us to now freedom of maneuver in the domain and in the terrestrial domains. So that was another concept I think is still going to need to develop further, but you'll see that's in 3-14, and again that comes out of a lot of the planning work that we had done and our understanding how we think a space campaign lays out, again, in synchronicity with a terrestrial plan. We don't do it all by ourselves. Yeah. We're doing it because there's something happening on the planet that we're responding to, and we're executing our plan in conjunction with that plan.
I think that speaks to the space components that have been standing up over the past year out in Indo-PACOM,
absolutely does.
CENTCOM,
yeah.
Where General Saltzman has said many times that the global space superiority mission, with his experience as a deputy CFAC, he understood that General Mastelier out in PACOM, nobody knows that area better than him. So when the Indo-PACOM commander needs space forces, not everything is going to be done, at the global scale. It's important to have those component commanders. It's good to see those continuing to. There's no question why that was the first one out there, stood up, and at a one-star level. We think that's important.
I'd like to point out we had a Tier 1 exercise earlier this year that involved both Indo-PACOM and U.S. Space Command. Theirs was Pacific Sentry, ours was Space Sentry, but they're all part of a broader integrated exercise. And I've seen a lot of Tier 1 exercises in my day, going back to many of the Global Thunder or Global Lightning STRATCOM exercises before we had U.S. Space Command 2.0 and how we used to try to do space. This exercise that I saw earlier this year was the most advanced, most effective integration of the space domain and the terrestrial domains I've ever seen. And I think the reasons are because you had Tony Mastelier's group out there doing that integration at the operational level within Indo-PACOM. You had us having worked hard on how do we synchronize our plans with a terrestrial combat plan, so it was sort of a test case for our O plan. And I also have to give credit to the Indo-PACOM headquarters staff itself, and that there was probably a greater understanding of what was happening in the space domain than maybe I'd ever seen in a different combatant command. So all of those ingredients together are getting us where we need to be.
Yeah, it's huge. And the Tier 1 exercises, training, they are intentionally deterrents as well. Our adversaries are watching our training. Are we at the junior varsity level? Are we at the varsity level? And when you see a varsity team train compared to a JV team train, there's value there. So yep. I think that's important. You've talked a lot recently about dynamic space operations. And when you just went through all the scenarios and various, when you talk about a Tier 1 exercise, dynamic space operations, sustained maneuver, known as DSO, I don't think a lot of our members, especially on the industry side, may be tracking that. Can you explain, in your words, DSO and what we're going and doing there?
Sure. This is a concept we've been working on here at the command for almost the last year. So it wasn't enough to make it into 3-14 this time around, but I think it will in the future. And again, I think some of your audience has probably heard me talk about it already, and we will have a paper coming out later this month on this, so to kind of get a better benchmark of what we're trying to get after. But the essence of the idea is to first and fundamentally realize as we're becoming experts in our domain and warfighting in our domain, is to realize that really everything we've done from the dawn of the space age in the space domain has been what I would call positional space operations. And the first reaction I might get from some people is, what do you mean positional? Those satellites are moving at 2-3 kilometers per second. I mean, that's not position. Well, from an energy perspective, they are. We launch them into an orbit and we keep them in that orbit. And we don't vary that much at all. Here's another way to look at it I haven't really talked about much is if you think about the energy it takes to take a satellite from the surface of the Earth and put it into geosynchronous orbit, traditionally, right? And you name it. It could be a commercial satellite, it could be one of our missile warning satellites, whatever. That energy, and then you think about how much delta V that we usually put on that satellite. It's like well under that total energy over its lifetime is less than 10% of the energy just to put it up there.
Right.
It's very small. And by the way, most of that energy is used keeping it where it needs to be, keeping it at its inclination or keeping it at its subpoint. So it's maintaining position. Even that energy that we use is maintaining its position. And you just have to realize that's how we've approached the domain. It's kind of how we had to. It's the beginning of work in the domain. It's expensive to put satellites up there. It's difficult. But just once you realize, hey, everything's technically, and why is it positional? Because anyone's tracking one of our satellites kind of knows where it's going to be tomorrow.
Right.
In the same way you kind of know where a fixed position on land or something that's anchored at sea, if it doesn't change, you know where it's going to be tomorrow.
Yeah.
So it's positional. How do you start thinking in terms of dynamic space operations, where platforms are maneuvering much, much more frequently and a much greater percentage of their energy use, the majority of their energy use over their lifetime has to be greater than maybe the energy just to put it up into orbit to begin with. And then you start realizing that there's a lot of our missions, they're almost all in domain. You got Earth-facing missions that benefit from this positionality, right? You want to have them hold it geosynchronous for communications or missile warning. You want GPS satellites to kind of hold their overall relative position to one another to enable good PNT. But there's many platforms that we have and have more coming that are in-domain platforms that don't really have an Earth-facing mission. And we want them to be able to maneuver often, to have sustained maneuver. And we haven't really gotten there from a design perspective or a logistics perspective. We will.
Yeah, JP 3-14 talked about offensive and defensive space operations. It talked about 100 kilometers, and I thought that was interesting, just kind of the why behind 100 kilometers. Just as a former air guy, I'm like, things don't work real well in an airplane above 100 kilometers. So just the science takes over, and that, for me, that was interesting to understand. And
well, that's actually why it's there, the von Karman line. It actually is. It's
yeah.
You know where we get that definition? It's the rough, the atmosphere is always changing its density, so it's not always exactly 100, but that's roughly where you and your airplane, you would have to go faster than orbital velocity to maintain lift.
Yeah.
That's really what it is.
Yeah.
That's what that line is.
I'll never forget it, because that definition.
There's no point.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's go orbital.
So beyond DSO, what other frontiers do you see ahead for space operations in the Space Force?
Yeah, so I think these curves of dependence, I think I'll call them, are not changing anytime soon. Society is going to continue to depend more on space. Our joint and combined warfighters are going to depend more and more on space, and so it will be more and more important all the time that we continue to protect and defend our space capabilities and ensure that those capabilities are there for the joint warfighters. I think General Salzman's done a great job talking about that in the future. But we have to realize that we can't set our horizons too low. We are focused right now mostly, and this is a U.S. Space Command as well as broader Space Force, mostly at geosynchronous and below. in the total Earth-Moon system, mostly. Why is that? That's where most of our capabilities are. But we have to realize that we're going to have to start thinking about the Earth-Moon system and how we understand what's going on in that total area. A lot of mischief can happen in areas well above geo if you're not there to understand what's going on. And we don't want to be the last ones to get there. So I do see that our operational space will continue to climb to fill out the Earth-Moon system. By the way, NASA going to the moon is going to be part of that.
Yep.
You know, we have a great tradition of supporting NASA in human spaceflight from the very, very beginning as a Department of Defense. And we did it through the second space age, right, with all the trips to low Earth orbit by just letting NASA know if there was a piece of debris that might be a threat to the International Space Station. We're still doing that today. How long before we start talking about lunar domain, space domain awareness and what's happening in lunar orbit? As dozens and dozens of missions, mostly uncrewed, but some crewed, are now head to the moon. And I think, you know, the Department of Defense is going to have a role. That's in our AOR. Understand what's happening there. And as our activities as humans, as a society, progress beyond the Earth-Moon system, there will be, I mean, this is kind of a theorem, right, that I think would be very hard to disprove. That as human activity goes beyond the Earth-Moon system, so will security issues, and therefore so will there be a need for a Space Force and for a Space Command to contribute to solving those security challenges.
Yeah, they often say that defense interests often follow security or economic interests, and yeah, I agree with you there.
Well, I mean, so what, I mean, should we be surprised, Matt?
Nope.
What domain has that not happened in?
Yeah.
You pick a period in history where there's been economic interest, and I'll show you security interests.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It always happens. And so in some ways, that's maybe the most optimistic thing when we see that we have security challenges in the space domain. Some might say, oh, that's disastrous, it's apocalyptic, it's dystopian. I would say, no, it's actually a sign that space is now normalized as a domain in human activity, because we also have to deal with security issues, like we do anywhere else.
Every other
the question is, how do we continue to ensure safe and sustainable and secure operations in that domain to enable that economic continuation and expansion?
Yeah, the final question I wanted to leave you with, and it reminds me of every time we hear our current CSO talk, he's just so proud of Guardians. And he says, hey, sometimes the best thing we can do is just get out of their way. Let that innovation come up.
Absolutely agree.
Build that culture. I think and General Hyten, for those that were able to see the ceremony, it just shows your unique personality that just gets people excited about this business. General Hyten's the exact same way. You can't not be motivated to serve by being in a room with gentlemen like yourself. But as you close out this chapter of this commencement after 33 years, what advice for young Guardians would you both close this interview with and your military service with?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd probably say for young Guardians, I'm jealous.
Yeah.
I get to kind of start out with this new service kind of young, and their journey in the Space Force is going to be a longer one than mine was of just 3 years since I was asked to join the Space Force. Although, you know, I'd like to think that even in the Air Force, we were laying the foundation for a Space Force and a tradition that we're going to continue. I guess I'd offer two things. The first is I have noticed, especially since in the years since we've stood up a Space Force, sometimes there's a discussion about, hey, how do we grow our space warfighting culture best? And I think it's a good question. We need to grow it, right? The analogy I like to use is, and I've been using it for years, is, you know, during that second space age, we really had a merchant marine in space that was getting space capabilities and delivering to that far shore, those terrestrial warfighters over a benign domain. Whereas now we still need to keep doing that, we need a Navy. So we have to grow that culture to realize that we have to do that piece too. And so it's a good question to ask, but one of the answers, or one of the ways that sometimes I've heard suggested on how we should answer that question is to look at the other services. All right, look at how the Marines do warfighting, look at how the Army does warfighting, Navy. Let's emulate them and their culture and try to think about integrating that. I actually disagree with that approach. I disagree. because our domain has its own unique challenges. And I think the best way to get after a space warfighting culture is first to really understand how to operate in our domain. And then to realize, and this is for every Guardian that's coming to work today, no matter where they're doing, that there may be 10 of that Guardian's counterparts somewhere else in the globe coming to work every day trying to figure out how to beat them. And realizing that we face a thinking adversary, and one that is not to be underestimated. If you put it in that mindset, that we have to be better than a thinking adversary is trying to be better than us in the domain, I think we develop a space warfighting culture that's based on winning and on victory and being the best. And that's one thing I'd recommend. And the other I'd recommend is just don't ever be satisfied with your level of knowledge. Stay curious. Always be learning. It helps with that first thing too, by the way, in terms of staying ahead of an adversary. That's been kind of a personal focus of mine from when I was very, very young, is to always be curious and asking questions and how can we understand things better, and therefore how can we be better at what we do. So in addition to everything else we do in terms of knowing our job and doing our job and take care of our people and working together, also continuing to sustain our curiosity about our business so that we are always the best.
I think that's perfect, and we at SFA are trying to help the Space Force build that culture and build those opportunities to practice being a warfighter and contribute to the joint force. And I'd be remiss if I left out our first Space Power Conference will be this December down in Orlando. And General Purdy has been a huge thought leader for us in that, to make this something we've never seen before. It'll be interactive. It'll be exactly what I think you just described. So we're excited for that.
I look forward to seeing it.
And sir, just want to thank you for your time. Thank you for 33 years to you and your extended family, which I got to see at the ceremony a couple weeks ago. And bottom line, we really appreciate your service. We appreciate your time today, and I look forward to seeing what's in the next chapter. Semper Supra.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Thank you.